I am so excited to have the chance to share with you today. My name is Olivia Carril, and I've been studying wild bees for over 2 decades now. And one of my very first really big bee projects was actually in Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument, what feels like a lifetime ago. It's always fun to talk about what I learned from this incredible place. And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to bees. With nearly 4,000 species in North America, each with its own unique life history and none like the honeybee, we could spend a year easily covering all of the interesting things we learned about these bees. This is especially true for a place like Grand Staircase-Escalante, where we've documented over 650 species. These wild bees are responsible for pollinating the majority of our native flowering plants. I love the work that I get to do because it's a constant and important reminder for me that bees on flowers is a tangible manifestation of how organisms from completely different branches on the tree of life interact to create the ecosystems in which we exist today. Of course, it can be hard for me to remember that connection once the bees are on their pins and their lives' work is recorded on this little scrap of paper beneath them. But I think it's worth the effort to remember it because it's really the most important part of what they do. When you see a bee on a flower, it's easy to see it as just a bee and just a flower. Maybe if you're me, something to collect if you're fast enough. Or maybe you think about what the bee could do for you. But rarely do we consider what a bee does across a ginormous landscape. Not just that one bee who visits many flowers, but the multitude of interactions playing out in synchrony across space and through time in that one place. The incredible variation in the floral form, and color, and scent, and size of flowers that we see around the world is the result of the constant interactions of bees and flowers. The appearance and life histories of both organisms is driven in large part by their reliance on each other. Though it's worth noting that while both need each other, there's kind of a love-hate relationship that's going on here. Every grain of pollen that a bee harvests from a flower for its own benefit is a grain of pollen that doesn't end up on the stigma of a flower. So every successful bee offspring comes at the expense of a potential plant seed, and vice versa. So we have, to take a term from a recent book I read, something called reciprocal exploitation. The appearance of the two organisms then is also driven by their intense need to manipulate each other into doing what they want as well. Put another way, just because two organisms interact in a way that benefits them does not mean that they both benefit equally. The interaction is mutual, but it's not altruistic. In reality, each species is pursuing its own self-interests, and any benefits to the other partner are unintended consequences of that interaction. Darwin actually acknowledged this when he wrote in On the Origin of Species, "I do not believe that any animal in the world performs an action for the exclusive good of another of a distinct species." More recently, Paul Westerkamp, who's been studying pollination for a very long time, described it as a balanced mutual exploitation. So let's look at a few examples of this. This is an orchid found in the Mediterranean called Orphrus epiphyra. It's an incredible flower. It's very distinctive in appearance, obviously. It's established a relationship with some really cool mycorrhizal fungi that allow it to survive in some pretty horrible soils. And it blooms in late spring, and apparently it looks like an attractive female bee. I don't know, maybe from this angle it looks more like a bee. Anyway, in the northern part of its range it self-pollinates, but in the Mediterranean a little further south, Euthera longicornis, which is sort of a longhorned bee, the males are often seen visiting this flower. In fact, not just visiting, but actually trying to mate with the flower. And it turns out that the plant produces floral volatiles that mimic the scent of a female bee. So the males visit, they try and mate with this thing, and in the process, the pollinia, which is the pollen of this particular orchid, gets stuck to the thorax, the back of the bee. The bee, of course, fails in its attempt to mate. It leaves in frustration, recovers its composure, and tries again, thus pollinating the flower, but not receiving any compensation for its hard work. We don't have to go to Greece to see bees and flowers taking advantage of each other. Here's a case where a bee who is too small to fit inside an Arctostaphylos or manzanita flower, found at the higher elevations in Grand Staircase, actually chews a hole in the base of the flower and steals the nectar so that the flower is unattractive to future visitors who might actually pollinate it. And here's another example, also from Grand Staircase. This small perdita on the left, that tiny little bee that you can see there, will quite often take pollen without ever touching the stigma. And so they're, in that sense, just stealing the pollen but contributing nothing in return. Flowers have ways, of course, to work around bees that steal all of the pollen. This is a sunflower, commonly visited by so many different bee species in Grand Staircase. And this bee species alone here, this Diunomia, which is a specialist on just sunflowers, is thought to be able to provision 3 or 4 offspring with the pollen from just one flower of Helianthus. So to make sure that the plant isn't completely stripped of its pollen, sunflowers release their pollen slowly over the course of like a week, forcing the bee to visit multiple flowers in a day in order to provision quickly. So this guarantees that the sunflowers of multiple heads get pollen deposited, and it also means that the bee has to return on successive days to finish gathering provisions. Pretty clever. Of course, bees counter the manipulations of flowers with more tricks of their own. Flowers in families like the mint and the pea family often position the anthers, where pollen is found, in ways so that the pollen is, it's deposited in hard-to-reach areas. So think of how hard it is to scratch between your shoulder blades. Flowers with their anthers on the top of the blossoms can deposit pollen in that same area on a bee so that it's really hard to groom off. And bees, of course, have countered this with corkscrew-shaped hairs on their faces that are extra efficient at harvesting pollen. So as the bee tips its head up while sucking up nectar with its tongue, those hairs scrape the top of the flower and remove the pollen to an area much easier to clean. This bee here is a native Anthidium species. It's a wool carder bee, and that they specialize specifically on flowers with anthers like that. So it's probably clear that there are many bees that are specialists, meaning that even when a wide array of plants are present, these kinds of bees limit themselves to some subset of the things that are blooming. Here's an example of one. This is a common specialist bee in the genus Melisodes. There's so many species in Escalante. And this genus, the males have these really long antennae, so the group is often called longhorned bees. These speedy flyers come out in the late summer and fall mostly, and many are specialists on plants in the Asteraceae and sunflower family. So the idea of specialists often leads people to assume that a specialist bee on a flower is often its only visitor, and thus responsible for most of its pollination. And there are, in fact, a few bees that do visit only one kind of flower, and in reverse, those flowers are only visited by that bee. Such is thought to be the case for Andrena astragali, which is a very poorly named mining bee that actually visits flowers of Zygodinus, or death camas, which is found in Grand Staircase when collecting pollen and nectar for its offspring. This plant has toxic nectar, and many other insects don't fare well when they visit the plant, so likely this relationship is one-to-one. Generally speaking, though, a specialist bee specializes on everything in a genus or family of plants. Of course, many other bees, like this green metallic sweat bee, are less specific when it comes to collecting pollen and will harvest whatever pollen they find on whatever plant they visit. So to demonstrate how specialists and generalists come together to form the base of a highly connected network, I made up a community of a couple of bees and plants commonly seen in Grand Staircase. So they're here. And this shows one of the ways that ecologists like to model the bee-plant relationships that we see. Along the bottom are 5 common plants in the desert southwest. And here are 4 bees that are also common, and they're likely to visit those flowers. So that's that longhorned bee again, which is a specialist on Asteraceae. I put in a mason bee, and we're going to pretend it's a specialist on penstemon. Many times they are. Bumblebees tend to be generalists, so they're found on lots of things. And green metallic sweat bees, as I told you just a minute ago, are also often generalists. So we can imagine that through their interactions with flowers, all the bees are interconnected, not only with each other, but also with all of the other flowers that are found here as well. And we can envision how if we were to remove one of those flowers, it might drastically alter the interactions of bees, both those that are close relatives, but also those that aren't close relatives, and also with all of the flowering plants. so that bees may compete more heavily on certain plants when the floral composition changes. So now let's reset and consider a different situation, specifically how things might change if a new plant is added. And what's really fascinating is that 9 times out of 10, the new plant is, of course, an invasive species, good at setting lots of seeds in the large part because it's really good at getting pollinated. And what's funny is native bees don't seem to mind non-native plants at all. And this can alter plant pollinator networks dramatically because they can pull bees away from the plants they would otherwise visit. And what you see happening is that things that were once completely interconnected end up isolated with different groups sort of interacting with each other, but with no interactions across the whole thing. So now let's look at an area of Grand Staircase. When surveying for bees in this area, my crew and I set up plots that we sampled in the same way every other week for a 6-month field season for 4 years running. And this created an incredible species list for the area that was at that time about 50 miles by 100 miles inside. So you can see on the map areas where we had our standardized plots, those are the ones in yellow, and also areas where we collected opportunistically, those little orange dots. Our plots were fairly representative of the monument as a whole, with about 72% of all species being found at one point or another inside a plot. And because we sampled with nets on different flowers, it also allowed us to examine some of the bee-plant relationships that occurred naturally in the monument and see how they change over time. So here's a plant pollinator network for one plot in 1 year, the year 2000. The yellow circles are bees and the blue circles are flowers. This is for just one plot, but it represents all interactions over the course of 1 year. And one of the things I love about looking at a plant pollinator network in this particular way is that it emphasizes the interaction above the species identification. Yeah, I've often thought it might be interesting to concatenate bee names and the plants they visit, so they have to be considered together as one entity rather than as 2 separate things. Now I'm going to show you how these networks change across the season. You can see that in May, astragalus and early blooming asters were the plants that the bees were visiting. By June, more plants were in bloom, that's the orange lines, and a significant number of bees had emerged to forage on them. July kind of saw a lull in the bees that were flying around. But in August, following monsoons, bees were out again, now visiting late summer and fall blooming plants. And finally, the season wraps up in September with just a few bees sort of flying around and a few plants hanging on. I'm going to show this once more in quick succession just to give a sense of how specific each month is. The turnover in bees and flowers in one area is incredible across a season and gives a sense for where connections persist and where they come and go. So now I'm going to show you that same plot, but in the following year. In this next year, 2001, there were 46 bee species as opposed to 30 of the year before and 33 plant species. The same bees can be seen early in the year, but this time willow was blooming just late enough that we were able to catch bees on it in May. In June, a few new plants were host to bees compared to what we'd seen the year before. July was wet enough this year to bring in a few more bee species. Here's August, and finally September to round things out. And remember too, there are a bazillion ways we could have looked at this. And we could look, as these guys did, at the strength of the interactions, counting each visit to a floret as a visit and making our lines thicker or thinner based on those. We could code for specialists and generalist bees differently. We could have coded for perennial and annual plants differently. And we could have looked at stability over time, with who is present in multiple years affecting their weight. So now that we've looked at a few plant pollinator networks and have a sense of their flavors, we can start thinking about how we might characterize those things. Remember that a plant pollinator network, it's just a model, a good as we can representation of what's happening in nature, usually based on the samples that we've taken. Of course, we're never happy with just having a pretty picture, so models often are quantified. Let me show you a few of the ways that these plant pollinator networks can be modeled. Connectance is the fraction of all potential interactions that are actually happening, that are realized. It's not a totally straightforward calculation, but it does give us a sense of what's being realized. So here's that original plant pollinator network I showed you before with all of the connections. And here are the interactions that are actually realized just for the year 2000. It's 45 out of 450 possible connections for a connectance value of 0.214 out of a range of 0 to 1. Of course, this isn't corrected for the fact that plants that were in bloom on which bees were never collected do not show up in this particular kind of plant pollinator network. So in fact, the connectance is probably even a little bit lower. And in this case, in 2001, even though there are many more interactions, the fraction of realized compared to what could be connected is substantially lower. So 61 out of 1,518 potential connections, or 0.07. And if we look at these interactions across 3 years, for each 2-week period, we can see that the plant-bee interactions are always changing across the season and between years as plants and bees naturally flux. Note that the structure tends not to change from year to year, though. There are usually 1 or 2 plants that act as hubs, with a few spokes, sort of bees, that tie the hubs together, keeping everything connected. In order to understand pollinator health, then, it's essential that we sample areas in a standardized way so that we can witness these changes over time, and it's important to sample for multiple years so that we can get a baseline of the natural variability that exists, not only for the bees, not only for the flowers, but also in terms of how they interact with each other. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. If you have any questions that you think of after today and you want to reach out to me at thebeesinYourBackyard@gmail.com, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks.